Have you ever wondered how one small decision can change the entire course of your life? How the simplest encounter, something as ordinary as buying a bouquet of flowers, can spiral into a series of events that are far from ordinary. This is a story about a woman who sold flowers on the street, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And one day, just like any other, a customer came along, but this one was different. This one would alter her life in ways she could never have imagined. Let's be real for a second. Life is unpredictable, isn't it? You think you're stuck in a routine, following a set path, and suddenly, out of nowhere, everything shifts. You feel it in your gut, the weight of it. That moment when you realize, this is the moment that's going to change everything. And as you sit there, wondering if it's a fluke, you can't help but wonder, what if? What if everything you thought you knew about yourself and your future could be turned upside down by something as simple as a conversation, a glance, or in this case, a customer? You're about to find out. But trust me, you won't see it coming. Now, imagine this. You're walking down a busy street. People are rushing past you, absorbed in their own little worlds. Cars honk, the noise of the city fills the air, and somewhere in this chaos, you spot her, a woman sitting on a cracked sidewalk, surrounded by buckets of vibrant, fresh flowers. Maybe you've seen her before, or maybe she's a stranger to you. You don't know her story, and you never really gave it a second thought. But this time, you notice her eyes. There's something in them, something that feels familiar, even though you don't know her. A mix of hope, desperation, and maybe a little bit of sadness. You pause, wondering if you should buy a bouquet, just to help her out, just to make a small difference in her day. You choose a flower, smile, pay, and go on with your life. But for her, this one moment, this one encounter, changes everything. And so, that's where our story begins. A woman with no illusions left, standing at the crossroads of life, selling flowers to make ends meet. She's seen her fair share of customers, and none of them really stood out. They came, they bought, and they left. But not this one. No, this one was different. As she handed over the flowers to the man, something passed between them, an exchange that would set off a chain of events she never could have predicted. And if you stick around, I promise you, you're going to want to know exactly what happened. Because, let me tell you, it's not what you think. You might be asking, what kind of change are we talking about here? Maybe you're thinking about some kind of big financial windfall. Or maybe a sudden, unexpected turn of luck. I won't spoil it for you right now, but let's just say, when she least expected it, this man changed her life in ways that took her from the corner of that street to a place she never could have dreamed of. The questions that followed were even bigger than the ones she asked herself every night. How far would she be willing to go to change her life? What if the very thing she feared most turned out to be the key to everything she needed? What happens when you meet someone who sees you for who you are, not for the role you play in the world? But I want you to take a second and really think about this. Have you ever been in a place where you felt like you were invisible? You know, where the world just passed you by. That's where she was. She was just a face in the crowd, selling flowers to survive. No one cared. But this one customer, he did more than just buy flowers. He saw her. He saw something that no one else had. He knew, somehow, that she wasn't meant to be stuck. And he made it his mission to prove that to her. It's crazy to think that in the middle of all that noise, that chaos, one small interaction could alter the course of a life. But that's exactly what happened. You might be wondering, how could that possibly work? Well, I'm going to take you through it step by step, and as I do, I want you to think about your own life for a second. What would happen if you came face to face with someone who saw beyond your surface? What would happen if they saw potential in you that you couldn't even see in yourself? And what if that led you to the biggest change of your life? I know, it sounds unbelievable, but trust me, it's real. And it's all coming up next. You won't want to miss a single second, because this story is full of twists and turns you never saw coming. The kind of change that's not just about money or success, but about discovering who you truly are. So, stay with me, because we're about to uncover the truth behind this encounter, the secret that would push her to make choices she never thought she'd have to make. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one simple customer, a man who probably didn't even realize the impact he was having, could change everything for her. But here's the catch, it's not just about the flowers. It's about what came after. The person she became. The doors she didn't know were waiting to open. And most importantly, the realization that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as random as she thought. That every step, every choice, every encounter, even the ones that seem insignificant, might just be part of something much bigger. So, sit tight. This story is only just beginning, and trust me, you're going to want to know how it all unfolds. You might think you have it all figured out, but by the end, I promise you, you'll see the world through a different lens. Just one small act, one flower, one smile, one conversation, can change everything. But the real question is, was she ready for the change? Stick around, because the answer will leave you thinking long after the video ends. As the woman stood there on that bustling street corner, her life might have appeared like the same routine as it always was. But beneath the surface, everything was anything but ordinary. Her name was Clara, and though you might have passed her by without a second thought, she had lived a life full of complexity, heartache, and dreams that had long since faded into the background. The flowers she sold weren't just a source of income, they were the remnants of something that had once been her hope. Once upon a time, she had imagined a future where she wasn't chained to the harsh realities of city life, where she could do more than simply survive. But over the years, the harshness of reality had worn her down, and now, all she had were these flowers, a small cardboard sign that read fresh blooms, any size, any budget, and the occasional passerby who might spare $1 or $2. Clara's story wasn't one of bad luck, though, at least not entirely. She had grown up in a small town, full of dreams about escaping the monotony of rural life. She had been a good student, worked hard, and earned a scholarship to a prestigious college. Everything had seemed so perfect. But somewhere along the way, life's plans diverged from hers. A bad relationship in her early 20s, one that she had foolishly believed was her happily ever after, had left her emotionally and financially scarred. Then came a series of unfortunate events, from losing her job in a downtown office to falling behind on rent, and before she knew it, she found herself without a stable place to live. What followed was a downward spiral of decisions she'd never imagined she would make. Moving from shelter to shelter, Clara had eventually found a small space in the back of a rundown apartment complex where she could barely keep her head above water. The flowers, which she had started selling out of desperation, were her only real escape. But even in that small corner of the street, Clara hadn't given up entirely. Despite everything, she still clung to the belief that someone would eventually show her a way out. After all, life was full of surprises, right? That was the hope that still kept her going, though she rarely allowed herself to express it. Deep down, she'd come to realize that the world wasn't kind, and that people were often indifferent to her struggles. Yet, when she met that man, when he approached her with his polite smile and warm eyes, it was as though something deep inside her stirred for the first time in years. But Clara's new hope, the one that had been quietly blossoming from that one brief moment of connection, wasn't as simple as it seemed. There were things about her life that she hadn't shared with anyone, things that she kept hidden, even from herself. You see, Clara hadn't been alone on that street corner for no reason. While she tried to put on a brave face for the occasional customer, there were whispers around the neighborhood, rumors that ran much deeper than just a woman selling flowers to make ends meet. Clara had crossed paths with some unsavory characters over the years, some of them with connections to the city's darker corners, and no one could deny that her ties to certain people were more complicated than anyone realized. There were the occasional men who would show up, not to buy flowers, but to keep an eye on her, to make sure she stayed in line. Her past wasn't just a series of bad decisions, it had become a maze of debts, unspoken promises, and a growing list of people she wished she could forget. One name in particular seemed to always pop up in her mind when she thought about her past: Mark Turner. He was a man from her old life, someone she had known before everything started to crumble. Mark was one of those people who always seemed to show up at the most inconvenient times, and his presence was never comforting. He was smooth, charismatic, and knew how to manipulate situations to his advantage. While he wasn't a part of her life anymore, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that he still had his fingers in some of the more dangerous dealings that had pulled her into this mess in the first place. She tried to forget him, but Mark had a way of getting under her skin. And every time she saw someone walking down the street with an air of mystery about them, she couldn't help but wonder if they were connected to him. But was this customer, the one who had just bought flowers that day, really connected to Mark? Or was Clara simply seeing shadows where none existed? Could someone like him really have the power to change her life in the way she was beginning to imagine? The questions were there, lingering in the back of her mind, but Clara refused to entertain them for too long. After all, she had already been down this path of mistrust and suspicion before, and it led her nowhere good. Still, there was a gnawing feeling in her gut, something she couldn't shake, something about the way he had looked at her. His eyes were sharp, piercing, and there was something behind them that didn't quite add up. But then, as the hours passed and the streetlights flickered on, something even stranger happened. Clara's phone buzzed with a message. It was an unknown number, but the message was clear. "I know what you're up to. Don't make me come find you." A chill ran down her spine. Who could it be? And why now? Her hand shook as she tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Could it be someone from her past? Or was this just some random threat, meant to scare her into submission? The more Clara tried to push it out of her mind, the more the message lingered in her thoughts. She had learned the hard way not to ignore these kinds of things. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. And then, in the midst of all the tension and confusion, came the phone call. It was from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in a while. "Clara, I need to warn you," the voice on the other end of the line said, panic evident in their tone. "Mark's back in town, and is looking for you." The blood drained from Clara's face. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Had he somehow tracked her down? What did he want from her now? Was she in danger again? And why was this stranger on the street so connected to it all? The more Clara tried to make sense of it all, the deeper she sank into the murky waters of uncertainty. She had no answers, just more questions, and it felt as though the walls were closing in around her. Was this just the beginning of a new chapter? Or had she unwittingly stepped into a trap from which there was no escape? One thing was certain, this customer, the man who had changed everything with a simple purchase of flowers, was now at the center of a storm that Clara couldn't control. And as she prepared to face whatever was coming next, she couldn't help but wonder, was the chance for a new life worth the price she would have to pay? The following days after the phone call blurred together in a haze of uncertainty. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big, but the pieces were so scattered, and every lead she tried to follow only seemed to lead her in circles. The message, the strange customer, the threatening phone call, all of it felt like a tangled web she couldn't untangle no matter how hard she pulled. And now, with Mark Turner potentially back in town, she was spiraling into a world she thought she had left behind. She tried to convince herself it was just paranoia, that she was overthinking it all. But deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong. But what? And why had the universe decided to throw all of this her way now, when she was barely hanging on? It started with a single, seemingly insignificant detail. Clara had kept a small notebook in her bag, one she'd used to track sales and jot down quick notes about people she'd encountered on the street. Over time, it had become a way for her to keep track of the patterns of the day, the hours when customers were most likely to stop by, the types of flowers they liked, and even occasional conversations that stuck with her. One morning, she reached for the notebook, intending to check her list of customers from the previous day, but it wasn't there. It was gone. She couldn't believe it. She had just had it the night before, as she always did, scribbling down a note about the customer who had bought the bouquet. The man who had changed everything, the one whose eyes had held a secret, that's where the note had been. But now, it was as though the notebook had vanished into thin air. It didn't make sense. Who would take it? And why? She retraced her steps, checking her small apartment, even going back to the corner where she sold the flowers, hoping it might have simply slipped out of her bag without her noticing. But it wasn't there. No sign of it anywhere. She felt the weight of that missing notebook like a dark cloud hanging over her. It had contained more than just sales notes. It had contained details of the customers who had made an impact, including that one mysterious man. She had written down his description, the way he had looked at her, the conversation they'd had, and the odd way he'd seemed to know so much about her without ever really saying anything. But now, all of it was gone. All she had left were the fragments of memory, and they were beginning to feel unreliable, slipping away from her like sand through her fingers. As the days wore on, the tension continued to build. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. There were moments when she would look over her shoulder, and there would be a figure just standing on the street, just out of the corner of her vision. Whenever she tried to approach, they'd vanish. She told herself it was probably nothing, maybe it was the stress, maybe she was imagining it. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. It felt too real. Too deliberate. There was someone out there, and they weren't letting her off the hook so easily. Then, one evening, just as she was packing up for the night, she saw someone standing across the street, watching her. It was a man, though his features were hard to make out in the fading light. She hesitated for a moment, the knot in her stomach tightening. Could it be him? Could it be Mark? The man she thought she had left behind years ago? Or was it someone else entirely? As she took a step closer, trying to get a better look, the figure turned and walked briskly away. Clara's heart raced. She didn't follow, but the unease lingered, heavy in the air. Something wasn't right, and she knew it. The next morning, Clara received another message. This one was shorter but more pointed. Stop digging. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. The words were simple, but the threat behind them was clear. Clara stood there staring at her phone for a long time, wondering if she should just ignore it. Maybe it was just another scare tactic, something to push her into silence. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. There was too much at stake. And yet, the question remained, who was behind this? Who was trying so desperately to keep her from uncovering the truth? Later that day, Clara met with an old acquaintance, someone she hadn't seen in a while, Sarah, a woman from her past who had helped her when things were particularly rough. Sarah wasn't exactly the most trustworthy person, she had her own set of secrets, but she was also someone who knew how to navigate the city's underworld. She was the type of person who could get you answers if you were willing to pay the price. Clara had never fully trusted Sarah, but she had a hunch that Sarah might know something about the shady dealings from her past. Maybe she could shed light on what was really going on. As they sat at a small cafe, Clara decided to open up, sharing the details of the strange man and the threats she had received. Sarah listened intently, her face unreadable, but there was something in the way she kept looking around the room that made Clara uneasy. When Clara finished speaking, Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying her for a moment before speaking. You don't want to go down that road, Clara, Sarah warned, her voice low and almost cautionary. Trust me, it's not worth it. Some things are better left buried. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard Sarah speak like that before. There was a finality in her tone, as though she knew something Clara didn't. But when Clara pressed her, when she asked why, Sarah simply shook her head and refused to elaborate. It was as if she was hiding something important. Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. Could Sarah be involved in this in some way? Had she been trying to warn her, or was she trying to scare her into backing off? As Clara left the cafe, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her even more. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were pieces of this puzzle she was missing. Who could she trust? Was Sarah really just trying to protect her, or was she part of a larger scheme? Was the mysterious customer someone she should be afraid of, or was he her only hope for escaping the past? And what about Mark, was he really back, or was it just a ghost from her past trying to haunt her again? Just as Clara was about to leave the cafe and make her way back to her street corner, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A figure, standing in the doorway of a building across the street, watching her. It wasn't Mark. This time, it was a woman. And as Clara's gaze met hers, the woman quickly turned and disappeared into the shadows. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. What was happening? Who were these people, and why were they so determined to keep her from finding the truth? What was so important that they'd go to such lengths to keep her from uncovering it? She didn't know the answers yet, but she was certain of one thing: whoever was behind all of this wasn't going to stop. And neither was she. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized that the truth might be darker than she could have ever imagined. And just when she thought she was getting closer, the ground beneath her feet began to shift once again. Clara couldn't sleep that night. The image of the woman watching her from across the street replayed over and over in her mind like a scene she couldn't shut off. There was something familiar about her, something buried in memory, but no matter how hard she tried to recall, it just wouldn't surface. She lay awake with her phone beside her, waiting for another anonymous message, another warning, but the silence felt even more unsettling than the threats. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl because you knew something was coming, you just didn't know when. As the hours dragged on and the sky slowly shifted from night to dawn, Clara's thoughts kept circling back to one question: why now? Why was all of this happening again after she'd managed to stay under the radar for so long? It wasn't until the following morning that things truly took another turn. Clara received a call from her younger brother, Jesse, someone she rarely heard from unless it was something urgent. Jesse had taken a very different path in life, staying far away from the streets and the weight of their family history. He worked in IT now, lived in the suburbs, and kept his distance from the mess Clara had found herself in years ago. So when his name lit up on her screen, her stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Jess's voice was low, tight with unease. "Clara," he said, without a greeting, "I got a message. Someone sent it to my personal email. It just said, 'Tell your sister to stop asking questions. Or you're next.'" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Jesse didn't even know what she was investigating. How could they possibly have reached him? And worse, why threaten him at all unless whoever was behind this was willing to take it even further than she thought? The message to Jesse changed everything. Until now, Clara had believed she was the only target. That this was about her past, her decisions, her involvement with Mark and the others. But now it was spilling over, reaching into parts of her life she had tried to keep separate. That meant someone was watching her closely enough to know her family, to know where they lived, and how to get to them. That kind of reach wasn't just about petty threats. It was calculated, professional, and far more dangerous than she had imagined. Clara begged Jesse to forward the email, to let her see the source, but when he checked again, the message was gone. Deleted automatically. No trace of it in the inbox, trash, or sent folders. It was as if it had never existed. Jesse, shaken, told her he was going to install extra security on all his devices and warned her to leave whatever she was doing alone. But Clara knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Then came the real twist, the one that made Clara question everything she thought she understood. 2 days later, she received a plain envelope slipped under her apartment door. There was no return address, no note. Just a single photograph inside. It was a picture of Clara and the man who had bought the flowers, the stranger who had started all of this. But the photo wasn't from that day on the street. It was from years ago. In it, Clara was standing in the background, younger, with a group of people at a community event she had long forgotten. And there he was, the stranger, standing off to the side, not interacting with her, but clearly present. The date on the back read June 2016. Almost 9 years ago. Clara's breath caught. How could that be? She had never seen that man before the day he bought the flowers, or so she thought. Had she met him before? Had he been following her life all this time without her even realizing? Her mind raced. What did this mean? Was he someone from her past, carefully watching her from a distance, waiting for the right moment to make contact? Or had someone doctored the photo to mess with her, to make her question her own memories? Either way, the message was clear: whoever was behind this knew more than they were letting on. This wasn't random. It was personal. Deeply personal. Clara couldn't help but think about Sarah's warning again. Some things are better left buried. What exactly did Sarah know that she hadn't shared? And why had she suddenly cut contact since that cafe meeting? Clara had tried calling her several times, texting, even showing up at the last address she had for her, but there was no answer. Sarah had vanished, just like the notebook, just like the email. As if she had never existed. Clara started to notice other inconsistencies, too. Things that didn't quite add up. A man she had seen regularly on the same street for months, another street vendor, had suddenly stopped showing up. People who used to nod at her or make small talk now avoided eye contact, as if someone had warned them off. It was like the world was shrinking around her, isolating her bit by bit. She felt it every time she walked out her front door, the tension in the air, the heavy awareness that someone was watching from just out of sight. And then came the report that stopped her cold, a woman's body found in a nearby alley, no ID, no witnesses, but the vague description matched someone Clara knew all too well. She waited, frozen, for confirmation, and when it came, it hit like a gut punch. It was Sarah. The police were calling it a drug-related incident, possibly a robbery gone wrong, but Clara didn't believe that for a second. Sarah had her flaws, but she wasn't careless. And it couldn't be a coincidence that she had died just days after warning Clara to walk away. Clara didn't say anything to the police when they asked if she knew the victim. She couldn't. Not yet. Not when she didn't know who she could trust. She walked home in a daze, her heart pounding, the shadows on the sidewalk stretching longer than they should have in the setting sun. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just scattered, they were being manipulated. Someone was playing a much bigger game, and Clara wasn't sure if she was the player or the pawn. But what terrified her the most wasn't the threats, or the photograph, or even Sarah's death. It was the realization that she might have been involved in something much darker than she ever knew, and that the man who bought the flowers might not have been a stranger at all. He could have been waiting for this moment for years. Watching. Calculating. And now, with the truth slipping further from her grasp, Clara was about to find out just how far some people would go to keep the past buried, and just how much she didn't know about her own story. Clara had always thought she understood fear. She had lived through enough nights with nothing but a thin lock between her and the world, heard the sounds of city streets shift from tired to dangerous when the sun dipped below the skyline. But what she was feeling now wasn't fear, it was something worse. It was the creeping sense that her entire reality had begun to warp around her, that the people she trusted, the memories she held, and the instincts she once relied on were slipping out of sync. After Sarah's death, she had tried to tell herself to breathe, to stay grounded, but something inside her had shifted permanently. The streets felt colder now, unfamiliar, like they were hiding secrets in every shadow. Her hands trembled when she reached for her keys. She stopped sleeping through the night. Every bump, every creak in her apartment sent a spike of adrenaline through her veins. It wasn't just about the flowers or that one stranger anymore, she was in the middle of something much darker, and whatever it wasn't done with her. The first real break in the illusion of safety came on a Monday morning, just as the city was waking up and Clara was setting out her buckets. She kept her head low, her routine robotic, but as she reached for the sign she kept under her chair, she noticed something had been slid beneath it. A torn piece of newspaper, the ink smudged and worn, but circled in thick red marker was a single headline: "Local woman found dead, no leads, no witnesses." The article was about Sarah. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, nothing to go on. Clara's heart pounded as she scanned the small block of text, but it was what was written in shaky pen across the bottom that sent ice down her spine: "You're next if you don't stop." The marker bled slightly, like whoever wrote it had done so quickly, maybe even in the rain, and the edges of the paper were frayed like it had been torn in desperation. Clara looked up and around, but the street was quiet, just a few pedestrians and the usual background hum of traffic. Still, she felt it, that sense of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing in from all sides. She didn't call the police. She didn't think she could. What would she even tell them? That someone left her a piece of paper. That her friend was dead and she believed it wasn't a coincidence. Without proof, it would just make her look unstable, and the last thing she needed was to be dismissed or institutionalized when she knew in her bones this was real. Instead, she stuffed the paper into her coat pocket and tried to keep her hands from shaking as she sold flowers to unsuspecting passers-by, her smile brittle, her eyes constantly flicking over shoulders and alleyways. But nothing prepared her for what came later that day. Jesse stopped answering her texts. At first, she thought maybe he was just busy, trying to pretend none of this was happening. Rumors of abuse, of police interference, even whispers that the non-profit had been quietly funded by a shell corporation with political ties. Clara had barely touched it, just logged a few intake notes, helped organize a candlelight vigil, and then moved on. Or so she thought. Now, it was starting to make sense. The stranger in the photo, he wasn't watching her. He was likely involved in that case, maybe a reporter, maybe something else entirely. Jesse had hacked her files once, back when he was still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. He could have come across something in those records, something he didn't even realize was dangerous until now. The notebook, the missing messages, Sarah's death, they were all pieces of a cover-up years in the making. Someone was desperate to erase the past. And Clara, by sheer accident or forgotten detail, had become a threat. The ground shifted beneath her. People she trusted, even Jessie, might not be who she believed. Mark knew too much but wouldn't say enough. And whoever was orchestrating all this was close enough to be watching her every move in real time. The worst part wasn't that she didn't know who to trust. It was that she didn't even know who her enemy was. But now she had no choice but to find out. Because this wasn't about justice anymore. This was survival. Clara sat on the floor of a public restroom inside a downtown train station, her back pressed against the cold tile, her breath echoing off the walls as she tried to calm the rising tide of panic clawing at her throat. Rumors of abuse, of police interference, even whispers that the non-profit had been quietly funded by a shell corporation with political ties. Clara had barely touched it, just logged a few intake notes, helped organize a candlelight vigil, and then moved on. Or so she thought. Now, it was starting to make sense. The stranger in the photo, he wasn't watching her. He was likely involved in that case, maybe a reporter, maybe something else entirely. Jessie had hacked her files once, back when he was still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. He could have come across something in those records, something he didn't even realize was dangerous until now. The notebook, the missing messages, Sarah's death, they were all pieces of a cover-up years in the making. Someone was desperate to erase the past. And Clara, by sheer accident or forgotten detail, had become a threat. The ground shifted beneath her. People she trusted, even Jessie, might not be who she believed. Mark knew too much but wouldn't say enough. And whoever was orchestrating all this was close enough to be watching her every move in real time. The worst part wasn't that she didn't know who to trust. It was that she didn't even know who her enemy was. But now she had no choice but to find out. Because this wasn't about justice anymore. This was survival. Clara sat on the floor of a public restroom inside a downtown train station, her back pressed against the cold tile, her breath echoing off the walls as she tried to calm the rising tide of panic clawing at her throat. Rumors of abuse, of police interference, even whispers that the non-profit had been quietly funded by a shell corporation with political ties. Clara had barely touched it, just logged a few intake notes, helped organize a candlelight vigil, and then moved on. Or so she thought. Now, it was starting to make sense. The stranger in the photo, he wasn't watching her. He was likely involved in that case, maybe a reporter, maybe something else entirely. Jessie had hacked her files once, back when he was still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. He could have come across something in those records, something he didn't even realize was dangerous until now. The notebook, the missing messages, Sarah's death, they were all pieces of a cover-up years in the making. Someone was desperate to erase the past. And Clara, by sheer accident or forgotten detail, had become a threat. The ground shifted beneath her. People she trusted, even Jessie, might not be who she believed. Mark knew too much but wouldn't say enough. And whoever was orchestrating all this was close enough to be watching her every move in real time. The worst part wasn't that she didn't know who to trust. It was that she didn't even know who her enemy was. But now she had no choice but to find out. Because this wasn't about justice anymore. This was survival. Clara sat on the floor of a public restroom inside a downtown train station, her back pressed against the cold tile, her breath echoing off the walls as she tried to calm the rising tide of panic clawing at her throat. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, the screen flashing with another blocked number, but she didn't answer it. She couldn't. Not yet. Everything around her felt like it was spinning, the strangers' faces that seemed too familiar, the photos taken without her knowing, the message about Jessie. The moment Mark had told her she was never the target, only a loose end in a much bigger story, something inside her cracked. She wanted to believe it was all some mistake, some overblown coincidence, but the weight of it had become undeniable. Whoever was behind this had resources, timing, and a plan. And now, they were tightening the rope with every move she made. The next message that came wasn't a threat. It was an ultimatum. She didn't even open it right away. She knew by the preview text that it was going to change everything. When she finally summoned the courage, her hands trembling, she saw a single image. Jesse, sitting alone in what looked like a storage room, his wrists bound, his mouth gagged, but clearly alive. The photo was time-stamped 15 minutes ago. Underneath it was a single sentence: "Turn over the photo and the name or your brother disappears forever." She stared at the screen, paralyzed. The photo. The name. What did they mean? The only clue she had was that old photo of the man who had bought the flowers, the one who had shown up in the 2016 image from the non-profit event. She had been holding on to it, thinking it was her one connection to the truth, but now it was being used against her. And the name, did they mean Mark? Or someone else? She didn't know what they were after exactly, but it didn't matter. The message was clear: give them what they wanted, or lose Jesse forever. The train station around her buzzed with movement, voices, lives going on like nothing had changed. But for Clara, everything had. She sat frozen, the phone in one hand and the folded photo in the other, her mind racing with what to do. If she handed it over, she might save Jesse, but at what cost? Would that be the end of it? Or would they come after her again, demanding more, covering their tracks until there was nothing left of her world? And if she didn't hand it over, could she live with that? Could she watch her brother disappear and do nothing? There was no good choice. There was only the impossible one. She thought about the last time she and Jesse had spoken face to face, months ago, on his birthday, over greasy diner food and soft, tired laughs. He had told her then, "Whatever happens, you're not alone. You still have me." She clung to those words now, biting down the sob rising in her throat. The sound of a stall door creaking snapped her back into the present, and she shoved the phone and the photo deep into her coat pocket, wiping her eyes as she stood up. She couldn't stay here. If they could reach Jesse, they could reach her. They were watching everything, and now she had to choose who to become: the sister who stayed quiet and safe, or the woman who stood her ground even when everything was crumbling around her. She left the restroom with a plan forming, but her steps felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. Every decision now was a gamble. She didn't know if Mark had been honest with her, or if he was part of the trap. She didn't know if Jess's kidnapping was even real. Maybe it was a staged photo, meant to scare her. But that tiny voice of doubt was too dangerous. She had to assume it was real. That Jess's life was on the line. As night fell, Clara found herself standing in front of another person she hadn't planned to see again: Lucia, one of the directors from the old non-profit, someone Clara had worked under years ago and had always quietly admired. Lucia had vanished from the public eye after some vague sabbatical in 2017, but Clara had found a recent mention of her in a tucked-away article about political donors backing a new surveillance startup. That was the final clue she needed. She didn't come to accuse Lucia, not yet, but the second Lucia opened her door and saw Clara's face, something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise. Not concern. Something more calculating. Clara asked to come in, her voice barely steady, and Lucia hesitated for just a moment before stepping aside. Inside, the air felt too clean, too curated, like a space built for performance rather than comfort. They sat in silence for a moment before Clara laid the photo on the table between them. "Why is he in this picture?" she asked. Lucia didn't look down. "You need to let this go," she said calmly. "This has nothing to do with you anymore." "Then why is my brother missing?" Clara snapped, her voice cracking with desperation. "Why am I getting threats? Why is everyone either dead or disappearing?" Lucia finally looked at the photo, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "You have no idea what's at stake, Clara. This isn't about that kid from 2016. This is about what the program turned into. About what we did with the data. We thought we were helping people, but we weren't. And now the people who funded it want it erased, every trace of it. Including you." Clara's mouth went dry. "What program?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. But Lucia only shook her head. "You were never supposed to know. I warned them that keeping records would come back to haunt us, but they didn't care. Now they're making sure none of it survives." Clara felt the room closing in on her. She stood, trembling, her fists clenched. "Where's my brother?" she demanded. But Lucia only gave her a look that said everything she wasn't willing to say out loud. Clara left without another word, the photo back in her coat, her thoughts burning with betrayal. It wasn't about one man. It wasn't about the flowers. It was about a program, buried beneath non-profit paperwork, designed to monitor, manipulate, and erase. And now the truth was just within reach if she could survive long enough to expose it. She didn't know where Jesse was. She didn't know if she could save him. But she knew one thing for certain: the people behind this were willing to destroy everything to keep their secrets hidden. And now they had made the biggest mistake of all. They had given her nothing left to lose. Clara didn't remember leaving Lucia's apartment, only the sound of her own footsteps slamming down on the pavement and the roar of traffic spinning past as she stumbled through the night. Her mind was racing, too full and too loud to think straight. Every word Lucia had said echoed in her head like a warning bell. You were never supposed to know. The idea of a surveillance program disguised as charity work made her stomach twist, and the thought that she had unknowingly helped build something so invasive made her feel physically sick. But it was what came next, what Lucia hadn't said, that drove the panic deeper. Who else had known? And why had no one stopped it? Clara had always believed the work she was doing back then had value, that maybe it mattered. Now, she realized she'd been part of a lie so much larger than herself, and the people behind it were willing to erase every last witness just to keep it buried. She barely had time to process any of it before the next blow hit. Her burner phone rang, the one she hadn't told anyone about, the one she only turned on when she needed to stay off the grid. The voice on the other end was flat, almost mechanical, but unmistakably American, and Clara's blood ran cold the second she heard it. "You were warned," the voice said. "You were told to stop. Now you've left us no choice." Then the call ended. No threats. No demands. Just a chilling certainty. She stood frozen on the sidewalk until she felt someone brush past her, too close, their shoulder grazing hers before disappearing into the crowd. That's when she knew she was out of time. They were closing in. Desperation pushed her to the only place left that might offer any answers. She headed to the basement office of a friend she hadn't seen in years, a tech-for-hire named Devon who had once been Jess's roommate back in college. Devon was skeptical at first, but when Clara handed him the encrypted flash drive Jessie had hidden in her apartment months ago, something she hadn't thought twice about until now, his expression changed instantly. He didn't ask where she got it or why it mattered. He just plugged it in, tapped a few keys, and then sat back in stunned silence. "Clara," he said slowly, "this isn't just surveillance. It's predictive modeling. Behavior tracking. They've been monitoring entire populations, not just individuals. They're manipulating outcomes. School placements. Job opportunities. Legal cases. All of it filtered through an algorithm designed by the same people who backed that nonprofit. This is government adjacent. Military funded. And it's still active." Clara's heart dropped. It was bigger than she'd ever imagined. She had been looking at her story like it was personal, like she was the one being targeted. But she was just a thread in a much larger web. The man who bought the flowers that day wasn't reaching out to her because of who she was, he had been trying to warn her. Or use her. Or both. She didn't know anymore. Everything was layered in lies, and now she didn't even know who had pulled her into the center of this storm. Devon leaned in, his eyes wide with realization. "Clara, you need to understand something. This project, it didn't stop in 2016. It evolved. That startup your nonprofit morphed into, it's still running under a different name. They're tied to biometric testing, facial recognition, AI-generated risk profiling, all under the guise of public safety and predictive policing. That kid who went missing back then? He was flagged by their system. He was never supposed to be placed in the program, and when someone tried to expose it, he vanished." Then Devon paused, his face going pale as he scrolled through a hidden subfolder he hadn't noticed before. He turned the screen toward her. Clara gasped. There were photos, hundreds of them, of her, Jessie, Sarah, even Mark. And worse, there were behavioral reports, emotional analysis logs, transcripts of phone calls she didn't even remember having. "They've been watching you since the start," Devon said. "You were part of the trial group. You weren't helping them, you were being studied. Clara's stomach turned as she saw her own name tagged under Phase 1, Emotional Response Testing. None of this had been accidental. Even her flower stand, something she believed was her escape, her peace, had been located within proximity of 2 high-risk observation zones according to the map on Devon's screen. Before she could react, there was a knock on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Devon froze. "That's not good," he whispered, his face drained of color. Clara backed away from the computer, her eyes locked on the door. They had found her. And now there were no more secrets left to shield her. Only choices. Terrible, impossible choices. Devon reached for a small case under the desk and shoved a new drive into her hands. "Take this," he said urgently. "It has the full dataset. The last backup Jesse made before he went dark. If you get this out, if you leak it, people will know. But they'll come after you harder than ever. This is the kind of thing that gets buried at the bottom of rivers." Clara stared at the drive, then looked at the door as the knocking turned into pounding. She had one shot now, to run and expose everything, or to hand it over and hope they'd let Jesse go. But deep down, she already knew the truth. They were never going to let him go. They didn't negotiate. They eliminated. And now, standing on the edge of her decision, Clara realized the only way forward was through. She had been hunted, betrayed, used, and discarded, but not broken. Not yet. As Devon moved toward the back exit, Clara slipped the drive into her coat, pulled the hood over her head, and whispered to herself the one promise she hadn't made out loud until now: they are not going to win. And just like that, the game changed again. The hunted was ready to become the threat. Clara's footsteps echoed through the hollow warehouse, her breath visible in the freezing air, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. The drive Devon had given her was zipped securely into the inner lining of her coat, the only thing separating her from becoming a ghost like Sarah, like the boy from 2016, like so many others she now knew were never missing. They were erased. The warehouse was buried deep in the industrial district, a location chosen not by chance, but because it sat directly above one of the original program's control hubs, something only revealed after decrypting a hidden layer of metadata inside the drive. According to Devon, this was the core node. If she could get inside, plug in the drive, and upload the data to a private server he had built off-grid, the truth would finally be out: every illegal biometric test, every falsified file, every targeted erasure. But the moment she pushed the rusted door open, she knew she wasn't alone. The air was too still, too quiet. No rats scurried in the corners, no distant machinery hummed. Just silence. Until she heard a familiar voice from the dark. "You always had to make things harder than they needed to be." Clara turned slowly, and there he was, Jesse. Her brother. Standing 10 feet away, alive, unharmed, and with eyes that no longer looked like the ones she remembered. His face was calm, too calm, like someone who had already made peace with what came next. For a moment she thought maybe he had escaped, maybe he had fought his way out. But then he stepped fully into the light, revealing a thin earpiece tucked discreetly behind his collar. Her heart cracked as the truth settled in: Jesse hadn't just been a pawn. He'd switched sides. "I didn't want it to go like this," he said softly. "But you're not seeing the full picture, Clara. They're not monsters. They're realists. The data we collected has prevented attacks, stopped violence, saved lives. And yeah, some things got messy. But that's how progress works. It's not about individual stories. It's about patterns. Outcomes." His voice didn't shake. It wasn't forced. He believed it. Her brother, the one who used to build firewalls in high school and talk about digital freedom like it was a religion, was now the mouthpiece for the very thing they had once sworn to fight. "They broke you," she whispered, the weight of betrayal too heavy to carry. "You let them turn you into this." But Jesse just shook his head. "No, I chose this. Because I saw the bigger picture. And now you need to hand over the drive, before it's too late." She backed away slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows. She'd come prepared for a confrontation, but not this. Not Jesse. Not the one person she had fought so hard to protect. Her fingers brushed against the backup drive in her coat as she weighed her options. She could try to run, but the exit was behind Jesse, and she could already hear footsteps approaching from both flanks. She was surrounded. But then something clicked in her mind. Devon had given her a final tool before she left, a remote device designed to trigger a dead man's protocol if she was caught. It was crude, untested, but it would fry the local network node long enough to trigger an emergency off-site upload. She reached into her sleeve, found the trigger switch disguised as a pen, and tightened her grip around it. "I don't want to hurt you," Jesse said again, his voice lower now. "Just give me the drive and walk away. No one will bother you after this. You'll disappear, clean, safe. You can start over. Isn't that what you always wanted?" She looked at him for a long time, her heart torn between the brother she once knew and the stranger standing before her. And then she said, barely above a whisper, "That's not who I am anymore." With a sudden motion, she slammed the pen trigger against a steel post. Sparks flew as the remote signal ignited the failsafe. Instantly, red warning lights flared in the corners of the warehouse, and Jess's earpiece crackled with static. The system was collapsing from the inside. Alarms screamed as Clara sprinted toward the console at the center of the room. Gunshots rang out behind her, one clipping her shoulder and sending fire through her arm, but she didn't stop. She reached the panel, yanked off the casing, and jammed in the drive. The screen flickered, then lit up, uploading. The files began pouring into Devon's shadow server, line after line of data flowing like a dam had finally broken. Project Echo. Predictive policing. Behavioral forecasting. All of it exposed. She turned around, blood seeping through her sleeve, and saw Jesse charging at her, shouting something she couldn't hear over the sirens. But just before he reached her, he stopped, frozen, his gaze locked on the screen. Something in the files made him falter. He stared, disbelief breaking across his face. And then she saw it too. There was a file labeled Control Group, Jesse M. Kessler. Clara's breath caught as she opened it with shaking fingers. It wasn't just that Jesse had joined them. He had been recruited a long time ago. They'd used him. Studied him. Broken him. He hadn't betrayed her. He had been programmed to protect the system, manipulated like every other subject in Phase 1. His free will had been rewritten, overwritten by years of embedded algorithmic conditioning. Clara turned to him, his expression twisted in shock, his knees giving out as he collapsed to the ground, mumbling, "They lied, they used me." It was the final twist she never saw coming. Jesse wasn't the villain. He was the final victim. Behind them, the warehouse began to shake as the internal servers self-destructed. Clara pulled Jesse to his feet, half dragging him toward the rear exit, both of them coughing through smoke and sirens. Outside, the cold air slapped her awake. The sky was just starting to glow with morning light. She didn't look back as the building burst into flames behind them. The truth was out. The files had been uploaded, mirrored across encrypted channels. Every name, every detail, every crime. She knew the system would fight back, try to spin it, bury it again, but the damage was done. And as she and Jesse disappeared into the crowd, no longer hunted, no longer silent, Clara finally understood something that had eluded her from the start. This was never about flowers. Never about one man or one moment. It was about waking up in a world that had quietly rewritten the rules without asking. And in that quiet, painful victory, she made herself one last promise. They may control the data, but they would never control the truth again. It had been 3 weeks since the warehouse burned, since the drive was uploaded and the data scattered across servers, news outlets, and encrypted networks like sparks from a fire. Clara sat quietly on a bench tucked into the far edge of a small public park, watching as early evening sunlight filtered through the branches above her. The world hadn't ended. No dramatic headlines splashed across TV screens. No sweeping arrests or public reckonings. But the tremors had begun, quiet ripples felt beneath the surface of everyday life. Independent journalists started asking the right questions, watchdog groups began tracing money trails, and anonymous leaks fed stories that couldn't be ignored forever. There was talk now, hushed but growing louder, about the so-called Echo Network, about behavior mapping, about the untraceable disappearance of vulnerable individuals. Most people didn't understand the depth of what had been revealed. But Clara did. And she knew what it cost. Jesse was recovering in a private care facility under a new name, away from the noise and noisemakers, slowly peeling back the layers of his own manipulation. Some days he remembered clearly. Others were fogged over, fractured by years of programmed loyalty and self-denial. There was no quick fix for what they did to him. But there was space to heal now. Space to be human again. Devon had gone completely dark, no trace of him left online, which, in a strange way, was the best sign of all. He was alive, still moving behind the curtain, doing what he did best, staying one step ahead. Lucia, on the other hand, had resigned from her company under the vague banner of personal reasons. But a Senate subcommittee had already opened an inquiry into the funding trail that ran through her non-profit's shell accounts. It wouldn't be enough, not yet, but the thread was unraveling, and for now, that was something. As for Clara, she had disappeared from the public eye entirely. She'd shut down the flower stand, packed what little she owned into a backpack, and started over in a town where no one asked questions. It wasn't about running. It was about reclaiming her silence, owning her time again after it had been stolen for so long. Each day still came with moments of doubt, with flashes of the trauma she hadn't yet named, but she carried those things the same way she carried the truth, carefully, without shame, and with the knowledge that she had survived it. People online were beginning to share their own stories, survivors of similar programs, whistleblowers with fragments of files, relatives who'd always suspected something was wrong but had never been able to prove it. They called it the echo effect, a growing awareness that the systems we trust too easily might be listening for the wrong reasons. One night, Clara received a package with no return address. Inside was a small digital recorder and a note that simply said, "Keep this safe. Someone else will need it." When she played the recording, she heard the voice of the boy from the 2016 case, the one who'd vanished. The voice was scratchy, tired, full of static, but unmistakably real. He spoke about being relocated, reconditioned, tested under new aliases. He spoke about waking up in places he didn't remember entering, about watching others disappear when they asked the wrong questions. His final words were the kind that stuck with you: "I didn't disappear. I was removed." If you're hearing this, make sure they don't remove you too. Clara sat still long after the audio ended, the recorder resting in her lap like a fragile artifact. Somewhere, someone had helped him get out, just like Devon had helped her. The chain wasn't broken. The resistance was still alive. In the days that followed, she began to write, not to publish, not yet, but to document everything from the start. The flowers, the stranger, Sarah, Jesse, Mark, the whispers no one else heard. She filled page after page with a truth no algorithm could predict, no biometric scan could decode. Not because she needed the world to know her story, but because someday someone else might find themselves standing where she once stood, confused, alone, holding onto a single thread. And when they did, she wanted them to understand they weren't crazy. They weren't alone. The systems could watch. They could manipulate, erase, and silence. But they couldn't erase what lived in memory, what was passed from one voice to the next like a secret map. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting gold into shadow, Clara stood and slipped the recorder into her coat pocket. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if the full truth would ever be acknowledged in the open. But she knew this: the moment you stop being afraid to ask the hard questions is the moment they lose power over you. She walked away from the bench without looking back, her steps steady, her presence untraceable, her silence no longer a burden but a choice. Somewhere in the distance, city lights flickered on like signals, and the first night wind of fall stirred the air around her. The truth had found its way into the world, and it wasn't done echoing yet.